All right, so it has been 30 days since my last update. Actually, 35 days, but it's been a little busy in my life and work and whatnot, so it's been had to delay my latest update. So it has now been 120 days since I've started learning Latin, which is pretty exciting. I'd say the last month has been very productive despite getting sick and work ramping up again and vacation being over. But a lot's happened, a lot of exciting Latin I've learned, and so I want to talk about it. All right, so why don't we jump to my spreadsheet and talk about what I've read the last 30 days. So let's take a look. Okay, so this is my spreadsheet. Talked about it last month, how I'm tracking basically everything that I've read in Latin. And I don't record repeats. I also don't record listening just because it's too tricky. It's not too tricky to record audio or to write down how much you're listening, but I'm not bothering with it. I'm maybe when I start to prioritize it, which I will probably at one point, I might record it just to make myself accountable, make sure I get like an hour a day or something like that, just to make sure I do it. But for now, I'm fine with not worrying too much about the audio component of my learning, even though I think it is important, as I'll talk about in a little bit. I would say for me, it's at least psychologically more of a supplement to my reading. You don't have to view it that way. I think, again, audio is really important for learning. I think you can benefit a lot from it, but that's just kind of the approach I'm taking right now. It's there, it's important, but it's not as important as reading. So again, that's more my own personal language learning values, not any kind of objective statement about the science of language learning or anything like that. So how much have I read? Currently, I'm up to 240,858 words read in Latin. And again, not including rereading stuff or listening to stuff. If it's been 35 days since I've last updated, that means that I read approximately 3,700 words per day in Latin. My goal was close to 5,000 words a day, but didn't work out that way. But that's okay. 3,700 words a day, still not too bad. So that's cool. Now, in terms of the percentage, that means that I've read 1/4 of all the words I need to read in order to be officially not a beginner anymore and finally go be an intermediate Latin learner, at least from my opinion. Basically, the way I view it is if I'm still using learner material, I consider myself a beginner. So if I'm still reading, Ad Alpes or Ricky's Fabula, if I'm reading any of those readers, if I'm reading any textbooks for my immersion, for my reading practice, I still can consider myself in the beginner stage. Once I can start to read authentic text, whether it's the Vulgate, whether it's easy plays, or whether it is Nepos, or even Julius Caesar, why not? Or simple letters and stuff. Once I can start to approach those things, I'll consider myself intermediate. And that might seem like, and when I say approach, I mean actually read them, and that I can read them and mostly understand them, but there are lots of words I have to look up. But once I look up those words, those individual sentences make more and more sense, that I can generally follow the plot or the flow of ideas well, even if I'm missing tons of detail. That's what I mean by approaching to read those things. So I don't think I'm there yet. Definitely not for most authentic text. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but that's how I define beginning, intermediate, and advanced for Latin for myself. Beginning means using learner materials. Once I'm just exclusively using authentic text, whether it's the easiest stuff out there or not, that is intermediate stage. Once I can start to approach at least some of the most advanced texts, like high literature, once I can start to approach high literature, then I would consider it like probably poetry as well. Once I'm approaching poetry and can read it well, or at least I can read it fluidly and not just be like completely lost to what's even going on. If I can start approaching those kind of texts, especially poetry, I guess I would consider myself advanced, but maybe I'll reassess these different levels at a later date. Anyways, let's get into what I read. Okay, so number one, I finished all of Legentibus, at least all of Daniel Pedersen's learner material that he wrote for Legentibus app, and that includes all his novice stories, I believe they're called, the super easy stories with relatively few unique words. He also had a collection of stories in easy Latin, 4 volumes, which are all good, relatively few, less than 300 unique words, and with quite a lot of words in them, over almost 3,000 for most of these. And after that, I also read Pugio Bruti, which is his novella. It's highly regarded, 10,000 words in it, only 350 unique words. And then finally, Fabulae Latinae, Volume 1, Fabulae Latinae, Volume 2, which are, I think, a little more advanced than Pugio Bruti, just a touch, mostly for vocabulary purposes. not so much grammar or anything, because in Pugio Bruti, I think he uses at least my sense is that, even though I'm still a beginner, pretty idiomatic. One thing I really like about Daniel Pedersen's work and his writing is that he likes to attest everything that he includes, certain expressions, certain ways of describing things in his notes. He'll talk about, this is kind of an expression you'll see in a play by Terence. I think he's an easy playwright. I believe that's his name. Or this is a famous expression. This is a common expression in Cicero's writing. Or Julius Caesar will often use this kind of ablative often in his writing or something like that. And he'll include this in his notes. And I think that's really interesting. I think that's really valuable, because then as I get used to those features, that means through his writing, that means that when I finally get to Cicero or reading the plays of Terence, for example, then they won't seem unfamiliar, and then it'll be that much easier to get into those plays. I won't have to learn those things. I won't have to acquire those things. So that's really cool. Honestly, I think that Daniel Pedersen, and I called him David last video, so sorry, Daniel. I think Daniel Pedersen should publish his novice stories, easy Latin stories, and Fabula Latinae as like a big book, along with all his notes, and maybe structure it slightly in terms of grammar concepts, perhaps, like things that he focuses on in each section, maybe. I don't know. I think it could be an amazing reader, I guess you would call it, because it wouldn't be a full textbook. I don't think you could just use his works, his writing. Maybe you could, I'm not sure. You probably want to use Familia Romana in conjunction with it. I don't think you could purely go through just his writing to get a basis in terms of Latin grammar and vocabulary, but it's almost enough where you could just make a textbook out of his stuff. And honestly, it would be the best textbook out there. I honestly think he should, even if it's not actually officially a textbook, making some kind of published thing where it is his novice, easy Latin, and Fabulae Latinae stories as like one collection in a published format with all his notes in a nice, visually interesting way, because it's quite a lot. It's about 30,000 words, which is about the same as Familia Romana. And it's also like really well written. All the stories are very interesting, like legitimately funny and interesting. And they're from a variety of different sources. Like some of them are adaptations of medieval stories or letters or Aesop's fables or fairy tales or mythology legends from like Norse culture and all sorts of stuff, or like Roman mythology, like tons of different interesting, a variety of stories. It's not all just like about war to prepare you for Julius Caesar. Some of these readers are just really just focusing on war terminology to get students to that point, but his stories are legitimately interesting from a variety of different genres. So it's great. So I don't know if that would actually if that would make money or if that would actually be popular, but I think a Legentibus book that was actually published for school teachers with all his novice and easy stories would be an amazing resource. So again, I don't know if this would actually make money or be a good idea business-wise, but I think it would be an amazing resource. So yeah, I don't know how it would work for glosses and stuff, because it kind of works in the app because you can always do like interlinear translations, or there's also sometimes a whole translation, and there's also tappable dictionaries in the app itself. So I don't know, maybe it would be challenging to make it work in a published format, but it would be amazing to have it as like a published work, I think. Anyway, so I read through it all. That was about, so if you include Pugio Bruti, which I guess I haven't mentioned that, it's also, I enjoyed that quite a lot. My only criticism is that I think the fact that there's only 350 unique words does hold it back a little bit, because sometimes the story is a little repetitive in terms of the language, which is good from a language acquisition standpoint, but I feel like it could just be, if there was just a little bit more vocabulary, maybe somewhere in the 500 to 1,000 range, I think it would benefit from that, at least from a storytelling perspective. Again, it's not really a criticism, because from a pedagogical standpoint, I think it was great. I think it told a somewhat interesting story. I can't say I loved it as much as some of his other stuff, but it was genuinely interesting, engaging. Again, plenty of the language was well attested and idiomatic, at least from my perspective. I'm not an expert, but that was the sense I got. But again, I feel like somewhere between 500 and 1,000 words might allow a better story to be told, perhaps, or more variety of things going on, because there was a lot of this person chased this person, and they went back to the inn, and they went back to the street, and then etc. I don't know, it felt a little repetitive in terms of just what it could cover because of the limits of the vocabulary, but maybe he'll write another novella, and maybe somewhere in the 500 to 1,000 range. I think it might be nice. And Fabulae Latinae was good. Again, some of the stories were somewhat challenging, some of them not so much. In terms of like how comprehensible, there were some stories I occasionally had to check the English translation to make sense of it. and then go back to the Latin and then think about like why it means that. And so occasionally I had to do that, but for the most part, I found them accessible and fun to read. So I really enjoyed it. I also read the short story by Luke Ranieri, I believe that's his name, the YouTube Latin guy, and he had a short story called Fabula Anatina, a Duckish tale in Latin. Doesn't get a lot of attention, but I was like curious. I'm like, I've watched his channel a lot. I'll throw him a bone. I'll buy his short story. It was an odd story. I'll put it that way. I'm not really sure who the story's for because a lot of the vocabulary and expressions were very strange, I would say. I'm not saying they're unidiomatic. Maybe they are idiomatic and maybe it is well attested, but it seemed like different kind of language than I've seen in other places. Let me put it that way. Certainly felt different than Daniel Pedersen's stuff. Again, I'm not saying that it's incorrect Latin. I'm not saying it's unnatural or anything. It just felt a little weird. And again, a lot of the vocabulary was very specific to the story, like animal terminology and nature terminology and some of the verbs just felt a little odd. And so it's like the vocabulary was awfully specific, but I'm not sure exactly how useful that vocabulary would be. But then you might argue, well, there's plenty of vocabulary out there that might not be useful. We still have to learn. But then again, so then is this for a more advanced student? But I feel like an advanced student, I don't know, would get much out of it. So I don't know. It seemed kind of strange. It seemed too hard for beginners, but not particularly useful for intermediates. And then I don't know. It was fine. I don't know. I just have a mixed feeling about it. It was entertaining enough about a little duck who got lost. Like I liked it, but I don't know. It was just a little odd, I guess. That's all I'll say. I'm not saying it's not worth it, but like I said, I think it's nice to support content creators. So there's that. Now, I also read a few readers. So Colloquia Latina, which was, I think, some of these I vaguely remember because it was a little while ago since I read them. Colloquia Latina are like little dialogues between people, and some of them I think are based on stories and stuff and ancient stories. Again, not much more to say about it. One recurring pattern I noticed. So I did mention in the last video that I sort of separate readers from textbooks and supplements on the assumption that readers are not going to do that thing where you start with simple grammar and then eventually slowly introduce it all versus textbooks which do that. Turns out that's not exactly true because a lot of those readers do that thing where it's like simple nominative accusative sentences, and then the last 5 to 10% are just like throw tons of vocab at you, throw every grammar thing at you, just basically very lightly adapt to Julius Caesar, like that kind of thing in the last like 5 to 10% of it, and it escalates very quickly that way. So I found it kind of annoying the way some of those readers were written because you don't get enough chance with the hard stuff to really acquire it because you spend all this time on like relatively easy like textbook Latin or basic Latin, and then all of a sudden it ramps up very quickly, and then you're like, whoa, what's going on? And then the book's over. And so you don't really get a chance. You don't get enough chance of comprehensible Latin, but with these more considered difficult grammar. And again, grammar it's not that it's difficult, it's just that it's rare or it's different from our native language. So that's something. So some of these readers I wasn't a huge fan of. Colloquia Latina, I wrote that maybe move it to a later position because some of the later dialogues were just pretty tough. I couldn't really break them down. I couldn't like puzzle them out. I kind of just read through them free flow style, just reading it one word after the other, not really trying to decode it, just trying to understand whatever I can. And so some of those later dialogues in the writing, it's not a very long thing. It's only 3,000 words. I was just in it, and that might be a little generous for myself. So as you can probably guess, then one thing I've learned is that just because ordering things based on unique word count is not necessarily going to lead to like going from easier to harder works. And I think I mentioned that was a possibility, and it turns out that's the case. That something might have more unique words might not actually be easier than something with less unique words. And so that's that. So I don't know. I'm sure there's a better order of ordering these, but I don't have a strong opinion about it. This one, The Fables of Orbilius, which was actually in the Legentibus app, but I found a PDF as well that I was reading from it. It was good. Again, kind of that thing where like relatively simple stories. But what's nice about even the simple stories and the grammar is that they all have a slightly different way of phrasing things and talking about things, and they use a little bit different vocab. So even though it's sort of basic Latin, simple Latin, I still feel like I grow from seeing different authors doing this sort of basic Latin, because then they approach it slightly differently, and then my understanding of Latin grows because it's in different contexts. And this one is just kind of like children's stories, The Fables of Orbilius, they were kind of these children's stories that kind of reminded me of Le Petit Nicolas, which is Le Petit Nicolas, or like Little Nicholas. It's a very famous series of French short stories, and there's a couple movies based on it. And they kind of reminded me of that, except again, it's that like the last 10% is just like full, lightly adapted, native, authentic Latin, essentially. And it's like relatively easy and then just ramps up right at the last few chapters, which again is kind of annoying in some of these readers. So that's what I noticed. Now, Cornelia, a new Latin primer, and the Carolus et Maria, those three are kind of a set. They all have roughly the same amount of unique words, and they are very repetitive. They use very simple vocabulary and very simple grammar, at least for a huge chunk of it. And then by the end, they start incorporating slightly more complex grammar. I don't think they use the subjunctive at all, as an example. That kind of shows how simple it is. But it uses a lot of terminology and expressions that show up a lot in Julius Caesar's writing. And I know that because I've looked a little bit at the Gallic Wars. I've been reading a little bit, not focused on it, but I've read about, I don't know, a third of the first book, I guess, something like that. So, and I noticed them. I was like, oh, I recognize that expression. And I read that in some of those readers, and so that was kind of cool. Not the most interesting reading, pretty boring, I would say. I don't mind reading them though. I learned a lot from them because it's very simple. I think my fluency improved, my reading fluency. Julia, I honestly don't really remember much about it. It's kind of just ancient stories from mythology and from the Aeneid and stuff like that. I don't remember much about it, honestly. I remember it probably did that same thing again where it starts very, very easy and then just at a certain point it just like cranks the difficulty up, and then I just kind of have to do my best to understand what I can. Orda Maritima is another one sort of similar to that. That one I didn't even try to do any kind of like thinking about each sentence. I literally just read through it straight through like it was English at about 100 words a minute. Just like try to understand what I could. I could I could gist it, but at that point I was just kind of getting tired of puzzling through things, and I just wanted to practice just doing more fluid reading. And I think you have to balance both, just reading very fluidly and just going through the text and trying your best to understand what you can. But I think there is a benefit, especially in the earlier stages, to think about the sentences and try to squeeze out what you can understand. Don't spend too much time on any individual sentence, but if you get confused by a sentence, go back and reread it, think about it for a second, see if it clicks together, maybe look up a couple words, double check that declension or that verb tense. And then if it clicks, you're like, great, and then you can move on. And I think there is a huge utility in that. You don't necessarily want to do that all the time. I think the more you are a beginner, the more that's beneficial. But there's a trade-off, though, because the more you do that, the slower you're going to get through material. And there probably is an inflection point where by not stopping and thinking about each sentence, you're going to get several times more input per minute or per hour. And that overcompensates for the fact that you're not thinking explicitly too much about each individual sentence. But I would say there's probably like an inflection point where that becomes the reality, and I don't think I'm there quite yet. Probably, a few 100,000 words, I'll probably be at the point where it probably makes more sense just to read widely and not worry so much about understanding every individual sentence. Whereas I feel like I get more benefit from thinking about it, because sometimes I'll be like I read the sentence and be confused, and then I'll just think about it just for a moment, and then all of a sudden it's like all the parts just sort of click in like Lego blocks, and then I understand it perfectly. And I've noticed that I noticed that in French when I was learning French intensively, that sometimes I'll read a sentence and then it's like my brain just takes a second to like finish processing, and then it clicks into place. And so if you read too fast, then you're not giving your brain a chance to do those things. And that's something that happens in the beginner stages. So I think I'm not quite at that inflection point where just reading fluidly, very rarely looking up things is a better strategy. I think there's still benefit and utility in looking stuff up. 38 Latin Stories is sort of an accompaniment to Wheelock's Latin. It was fine. Again, it does that thing where it's like pretty easy Latin and then just like basically lightly adapted authentic texts, and it was just like it was pretty tough. So even though relatively few words, I don't know, it was fine. I might go back to it one day and reread some of those harder parts, but in reality probably not. And then Easy Latin Plays, not much to say. It was fine. It was a story, I guess. Not too hard, just 1,000 words. And then finally, the last thing I just finished reading was Latin by the Natural Method this is by William G. Most, PhD, Professor of Latin. And I wasn't going to originally read this, but I was getting tired of some of these readers. I wasn't super inspired by them. So I was like, you know what? Why don't I do another one of those like textbook runs where I choose another textbook and just read through it from beginning to end until I get to the point where I start to slow down until I get to my level. And overall, I enjoyed it quite a lot. Basically, the structure of every chapter is a little bit of reading. So this looks like it's about, at the beginning he gives a little summary, which helps a lot actually, of what the reading's about. So you read the English first, and then you read the Latin. And because you already have the English context, it's so much easier to understand. And I think that makes it easier to acquire, in my opinion. And sometimes, occasionally, there's little English interspersed to make some potentially tricky spots more comprehensible, which is cool. He glosses the stuff on the right. And then there is some somewhat lengthy, pedantic even, grammar explanations. Most of it I skipped. Okay, like when it's stuff like how to construct the so-and-so tense using this stem, I always just skip that. Like, I'm not interested in that at all. Like, that's the kind of stuff that it gets acquired naturally. I'm not worrying about that, in my opinion. I know that's a controversial thing in the Latin community. Like, even though people allegedly think of acquisition and Familia Romana and stuff, I feel like people are still stuck in this mindset that you have to memorize. Like, you look at these stems and you memorize these patterns, and then you learn your declensions in that certain order, and then all the tables. Like, I think people still are stuck in that table mindset a lot of the times with Latin, and I don't think it's right. I really don't. I think that usually you should just focus on comprehension, and if you just keep on reading, these patterns will click. I'm not saying, ignore grammar. You read about grammar is totally fine, especially it's like, you can use the ablative for this sort of thing. You can use accusative for this kind of thing. Accusative, motion towards, or ablative absolute, or the ablative of comparison, or the ablative of, I don't know, what's it called? You use ablative when you use a tool, like if you're holding a sword, you say, if you hit someone with a sword, you don't say use a preposition with that, you just use the ablative. I'm not sure. Is that ablative of possession, something like that? I don't remember. Not that you have to memorize these things, but those kind of things I think are somewhat useful because they're like things, watch out, you can use the ablative for this or the accusative for that. Not that you have to learn those things, but I think it's helpful to look for it. But when it's stuff like, this is how you can construct the perfect subjunctive, imperfect subjunctive. It's like you take this stem and then you add this thing and then you add this thing at the end. It's just like, no, I'm not interested in that at all. So, and then sometimes you'll have these like exercise readings where you're supposed to notice specific patterns. I always read those, but I wasn't specifically trying to apply the grammatical concepts. And yeah, I thought the book was great. It sort of starts with Roman history, and I don't think any mythology. I think it's just all Roman history up until Cicero, I believe. And that was really interesting to read about, honestly, because in simplified Latin, I learned a lot about Cicero and where he came from. He was from the Equitatus class of people, which was kind of cool, I think, and a little bit about the history and about Julius Caesar and the rise of Augustus and stuff and the other people and the Civil War of Rome, and I thought that was all super interesting. And then after that, it transitioned to basically the Bible, so starting with Genesis, Old Testament stuff, so the Genesis and Adam and Eve and their descendants, and it goes all the way up to Moses, at least this first book. And I actually thought that was pretty interesting too. At one point, I do want to read the Vulgate, probably the Nova Vulgata. I'm not Catholic, so I don't have a lot of stake in which is the best version, Clementine versus Nova Vulgata, but that's probably one I'll use. But I do want to read that at one point, even though I didn't get into Latin because I'm a Christian or anything, but I do like the history of it and the idea that Latin is the Bible is such an important part of Western culture, and if I want to read medieval authors, I probably should read the Bible so that I can understand some of the references and stuff. And it's also just relatively easier writing, so that's good reading practice. So there's no reason not to read it. It's not like my passion to read more about the Bible in Latin, but I do want to do it at one point. But anyways, I enjoyed the Bible stories along with the ancient Roman stories, so it was all cool. And yeah, I learned a lot. I think this book does a really good job in terms of vocabulary, that they repeat new vocabulary quite a lot, but in a way that didn't feel obnoxious. It just kind of felt like repeated a lot, and like grammatical patterns as well, in a way that didn't feel too obnoxious. It wasn't really cycling through the grammatical patterns, but it felt like it had a nice balance of repeating things while at the same time telling these stories. And so I don't know if it would be very good as a first textbook, instead of doing Familia Romana, do this instead. I don't know if that would be a good idea because this is my third textbook series. I've already done Familia Romana and the Cambridge Latin course. So my experience would not be the same as someone just approaching Latin from the very beginning. I've heard criticisms of this book that there's too much vocabulary and too much grammar right away. There's a lot of vocabulary and grammar in Familia Romana, so it's hard for me to be objective. I enjoyed it just as a reading process exercise though. So if you've gone through Familia or Romana, I think it's great. Check it out. The annoying thing is that they don't include macrons, but to be honest, you kind of get used to it after a while because everything I read before always had macrons. So I was like, oh, text without macrons, how can I even read that? Turns out it's not that big a deal. And it's like not that big a deal. Like at the end of the day, you don't really learn pronunciation through reading, you learn it through listening and then practicing. So, when I want to develop my pronunciation, I'll just do a lot more listening and then it'll be fine. And I also realized like it's not that big a deal to be able to identify the ablative without those macrons, because often you can just, oh, that's ablative because it has the macron at the end of the word or something. But after a while, you kind of just get used to it and it's not that big a deal. But yeah, overall, again, I enjoyed reading it. I think it's quite a lot of reading. If you look at my spreadsheet, it is 33,000 words approximately. So that's cool. That's just almost as much as Familia Romana. And I found the stories compelling. So cool. Yeah. So now I'm kind of back to the reader train. I'm going to take a break from Latin by the natural method. I'm sure I will come back to it because there's nothing wrong with more reading. So it's just another 70,000 words, so why not? That's cool. And now I'm back on the reader train. So Pons Tirorum, which is I don't know really what it's about, but I've only read like the first chapter or like the first fifth of it, and it's pretty good. It's pretty short, but the first part of that I was reading used a lot of subjunctive, which I really appreciate because that's what I need a lot more practice. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I would say the three. So one thing I've noticed is that declensions of nouns, it's not really the thing holding my comprehension back. I'm not saying I'm a declension master or can always recognize it every single time I read something, but in general, I wouldn't say that's the main thing holding me back. Most of the time, for most words, I generally, especially with the help of context, I can identify what declension it is: nominative, accusative, ablative, etc. That context helps a lot because you're never going to be in a situation where you'll be reading a text and they're just random individual words and you have to name what the declension is. You'll always have context. So that helps a lot. And so I would say rarely is the issue when I have a difficulty understanding a text that's not knowing the declensions of the nouns. That's what's difficult. That's what's usually the difficult things. I would say maybe verbs, I would say, is still pretty tricky. That sometimes I find it confusing what the tense is occasionally. That, again, you can rely on context to some extent. If you're telling a story, it's probably going to be some kind of past, or maybe it's in the present, depending on the story. So, and whether something is the imperfect versus the perfect versus the pluperfect, for example, or the subjunctive imperfect, it doesn't really affect your comprehension of the story very much. Yeah, there's a subtlety to it, obviously, and if you want to write correctly, those things are important. But, something happened in the past. You don't really need to know exactly what kind of version of the past for you to understand the story. And then eventually, as you get better and better at reading, those distinctions will become more and more clear, and then those distinctions do matter, and then you'll be able to produce it in your writing. But yeah, I would say sometimes it's confusing, and deponent verbs are annoying. The way it's like it looks like a passive verb, but it's actually with an active meaning. That's what people say. A deponent verb it has a passive form but an active meaning. And I think Pugio Bruti uses a lot, which helped a lot because they demonstrated how it looks like it's a passive construction, but it just looks like that. And so that was helpful in Pugio Bruti. And so yeah, that's sometimes confusing, again, whether something's infinitive or it's passive or active or perfect or whatever, or future, so that can be sometimes confusing, I'll admit. And again, it's not too bad, and I'm getting better and better the more I read, but I would say that's a big issue. Another thing is just vocabulary, obviously. Like sometimes there's a lot of words in Latin that I don't always know, and even if I could I'm not good enough to guess what the words mean yet. I don't have enough knowledge of Latin to make logical guesses, or very occasionally I can. Like once in a while, if it's a very comprehensible text, I can make a guess. Oh, that probably means this kind of thing. But general, not really. So vocabulary is definitely an issue. And finally, the word order, I would say, is the biggest thing, honestly, because word order is not so clean and nice like in Warburg it typically is, or in other readers. It can be all over the place. Sometimes once in a while I'll go to an authentic text, like last night I was looking at, Thomas More wrote Utopia in Latin. Let's take a look at that. How hard could it be? Well, it turns out pretty hard. Still can't read it. And again, it's like, I'm like looking at them, like, I recognize a lot of these words, I think. I mean, some passages I'm like, well, there's a lot of words I don't know. And maybe that's just because it's different vocabulary when it was written. But again, it's often word order trips me up, and then combined with some of my weaknesses with verbs as well. So again, it's all stuff that will take care of itself the more I read, but I would say that's my main weakness. So I'm glad I didn't like actively try and memorize the declensions, because so far it's getting better and better and totally fine. And I'm sure there's just a lot of verb stuff I have to acquire, and little by little I will get there. Now, in terms of levels of comprehension, so I don't know if you're aware of the Refold method, but it's sort of a method and a conceptual framework of learning modern languages. To be honest, now the theory behind it I think is very applicable to Latin, and I suggest you check out the website to read about it. It's really cool. If you know about comprehensible input and all those sort of principles, I think you'll find it a very interesting website. But a lot of the techniques and tips about how to learn languages don't really apply to Latin, because they kind of assume there's plenty of visual media in your target language. But in Latin, there really isn't. Like, there's more compelling content produced in English every single day than has ever been produced in Latin in terms of visual media. So there's just very, very little. And so because you don't have tons of relatively comprehensible through visuals and voice acting content, you have to learn everything through reading, which is just very different than modern languages. And you also don't have native speakers as well, so you can't just talk with people as well to help learn. So a lot of the actual tips and like tricks of how to actually do it, like the actionable steps, not necessarily super applicable to Latin, but the philosophy I think is very applicable, and then that's why I'm sort of, in a way, I guess, adapting it to Latin. But even though it looks kind of like what everyone else is doing, reading Familia, Romana, and just making Anki cards and reading through readers, and kind of just this kind of vanilla, except for, other than I guess skipping all the grammar drills and stuff, or the grammar fill in the blank activities, that the Orberg style. Other than that, I'm not breaking that much ground in terms of how I'm learning Latin. But anyways, on the website they talk about levels of comprehension. So this idea that when you're reading a text, it's not just on or off. It's not like you either don't understand a single thing or you understand it perfectly 100% like a native Roman, right? There's a huge range, and this sort of represents kind of like the perception sometimes people have. So at the beginning, you don't understand anything. You start to learn a little bit, and your perception is that you understand a lot, but you're just sort of filling in the gaps. You don't actually, and then you get a little bit better, and then it feels like you still can't, and then you can't understand anything. And then little by little, you start to get better in terms of what you can comprehend. But then sometimes as you get better, it sort of feels like you got worse, even though you're actually getting better, because you're becoming more and more aware of what you don't know. And so it's a nice representation of how it feels like to slowly build your comprehension. Again, it's not on or off. It's a slow process, up and down. And what's cool though is they have these sort of numbers to represent, or levels to represent, how much you understand what you're reading. And just as a way to mark this diary, I thought it'd be funny to describe what it's like to read, say, Julius Caesar, for example. So level 0, when you're reading something, you've just started reading or just started with the language, and the language is complete gibberish. Like, you literally understand nothing. So when you're the very first day of Latin and you pick up the Julius Caesar, you're not going to understand virtually anything, like almost pretty much exactly 0. So I'm not that good. Level 1 something. The language is still mostly gibberish, but it has started to look or sound familiar. You've gained the ability to pick out occasional words. You still have no idea what is being talked about. So I definitely, for most things, I can definitely pick out individual words when I'm reading. So that's cool. Level 2, bits and pieces. You can recognize 1 or 2 words in most sentences, and every once in a while you understand an entire sentence. You have an extremely vague sense of what sort of things are being talked about. I would say that's pretty much what I'm like. So you know what? It's usually like I usually can recognize most of the words, honestly. It's more than just 1 or 2 words, but it's usually like how they all fit together that I only have the vaguest of sense sometimes of what it's talking about, unless I check the translation and then go back and then realize, oh, that's what it's talking about. That oftentimes it's less a vocabulary issue and more sentence structure and verb tenses maybe. I'm not sure. Level 3, gist. You can recognize at least half the words being used, and it's not uncommon for you to fully understand entire sentences. You're able to follow along with most of the main ideas that are expressed, but many smaller details are lost. So I would say probably when I'm reading Julius Caesar, I would say I'm somewhere between 2 and 3, mostly 2. Not very good, but that's fine. I mean, I never expected at this point to be able to read Julius Caesar, but that's kind of my experience. But you can still learn from it. Like, if you look up stuff, check the translation, go back to it, you're still learning by going through that process. But yeah, my comprehension is still slow. Generally speaking, like when you're reading, you want to have somewhere between 3 and 4. Ideally 4, meaning that you can understand the story, but there's lots of little details, but some details are lost here and there. Like if you can do that, then that's a good spot to be. Level 5 is basically 100% comprehension, but there's subtle nuance that you're missing. Like you don't have quite a native speaker's nuanced understanding of certain expressions or words or connotations and cultural references quite the same level, and it's also quite mentally taxing. So most French that I consume, I would say, is level 5 for me, as an example. And like if we're talking about, say, YouTube, for example, most YouTube that I watch in French without subtitles is level 5, meaning that I can understand close to perfect almost virtually everything. The odd word I miss, the odd expression, maybe they said it slightly fast that I missed it or something, but for the most part, virtually everything. But it still takes much more mental energy than English, and there's still subtle nuance that I'm missing, or subtle emotion perhaps, or other connotations that I'm missing that I don't have it's not quite automatic. It's not like literally just pure meaning going into my brain as compared to, say, with English. And then automatic is, of course, it's like essentially native level, I would say. Like you understand virtually everything, no details are lost, the subtlest level of nuance, and it takes very little energy to consume. So will I ever get there for Latin? Maybe not. Maybe it's not even possible. I'm sure it is possible. If you read enough, you can get there, but it's a long, long road. So if I can get to a level 3 or 4 for authentic text, that would be what I would say consider myself to be in the intermediate level. So again, currently I'm in the slums, the bits and pieces right now, so not quite there yet. But the more I read, the better I'll get. Yeah, so that's where I'm at. So I read quite a lot. I would say I feel like I made a lot of progress this month, and I definitely experienced that thing where some days you feel like you're the god of Latin, you feel like Zeus himself or Jupiter, and then sometimes you feel like I don't know anything about Latin, and I'm like, oh, I have so much more to learn. It's like I'm chipping away slowly at the Latin thing, because it does take a while to acquire a language. It's not as easy as I was a little naive when I was learning Latin, not in terms of the techniques, I guess. I guess I had to remind myself the process of learning a language takes a while, and you have to slowly absorb these things. It's not done overnight, because in many ways it's gone very smoothly, because everything's going according to plan for the most part. Maybe slightly longer time frame than I expected, but not really. Sometimes it's tough when you're like, oh, I don't know that word, or I misidentified what tense that was or whatever. But again, these things, the more I do it, the better I'll get. So yeah, so the next month, the plan is just keep on reading. I don't know how much I'll read. I hopefully keep at the same pace as I did last month. Probably not, considering it's September, not summertime, but hopefully I'll get along fairly well. I'm looking forward to some of these later readers, which have quite a lot more words in them in terms of like just total words in the text. They definitely have more unique words, but that's okay. I mean, I need to learn words, so let's get to it. That'll be great. And yeah, I don't really have much more to say about that, I guess. Hopefully I will read another 100,000 or so words by the end of next month. Now, to wrap up this sort of update, oh, by the way, I want to talk about one thing before I move on to Anki, is that one of the recurring things I've talked about in these updates is this resistance to these exercises that people insist you must do to learn Latin. And it's one of those things that I think needs to be challenged more in the Latin learning community, because it's just wrong. It is wrong. Like, I think it's wrong. Like, I'm not an intermediate or advanced Latin learner yet, but I think just based on my experience so far and my assumptions and my knowledge of learning a language from learning French, you don't need to do fill-in-the-blank exercises to acquire these declensions or tenses. You just don't. And I know that because I did that with French. When I was learning French, when I was first getting into reading, any word I didn't know or tense I didn't recognize, I would put a flashcard and I would do a fill-in-the-blank. So it's like, this word is supposed to go there, and my job when I read the flashcard is to say what word is supposed to go there. And I also made another card where I would just have that word, and I would have to supply the whole sentence that it was part of as well. So if I had a word that was in the perfect tense in French, for example, if I saw the word, I would have to regurgitate back that sentence it came from. And then if I saw the sentence with the word blanked out, I'd have to supply the right tense for it and the right form of the verb, not only the right form. And then I also had another form of the card where it would have the same verb. It would have the verb just highlighted, and I had to supply the infinitive form of it. That's that's like the dictionary form of it in French. So I did that, and I did that for like 6 months, and I made 10,000 flashcards doing that process. So I basically did an Orberg style exercise process to learn French, and it didn't work. Isn't that funny? Like, it just didn't work. Now, these things are tricky to talk about because with language learning, no matter what you do, as long as you keep on exposing yourself to the language, you will slowly acquire it. So it's sometimes confusing to talk about because someone might do something, even if it's inefficient or not actually contributing that much to their success, but because they did other things that actually did, it all gets sort of mixed together, and it's hard to separate which things actually contribute and are efficient and everyone should be doing to improve their language learning ability or their language ability, and then things that aren't necessary. But my experience was that I didn't actually acquire a lot of these details and these grammar concepts by doing those flashcards, doing those fill-in-the-blank exercises. Again, the exact same thing the Orberg style exercises. And because at the end of the day, we acquire language through understanding messages, not through doing fill-in-the-blank exercises. And again, it's not that there's no, like, if you want to actively memorize it, you can do that, but that's not acquisition. It just isn't. Memorization is not acquisition. And especially with grammar is something that doesn't really work so well with active memorization. It just doesn't, because it's just a way of organizing the relationship between concepts. And in my opinion, it's much better time spent. You can memorize vocabulary. I think that's very beneficial just because there's so much vocabulary. But with grammar, generally speaking, occasionally looking things up, fine, but actively trying to memorize every element of the table or all these concepts directly, I think it's inefficient use of time. And again, because I did that and I didn't make that much progress. I mean, I did make progress. Like, by the end of it, I could read, say, the third Harry Potter book in French and with a high level of comprehension. That may sound pretty good, but I wasn't actually that good at reading at that point, because being able to read the third Harry Potter book, a book for children, and it's translated literature, in my opinion, not that impressive in French. That sounds really snobbish, I'll admit, and kind of gatekeeping, and like, I sound like I'm building myself up a lot. When I think of like high level of learning a language and reading specifically, I mean like the ability of like a smart high school student to read, which is an incredibly high level. And I don't think I'm even quite there. I mean, in French, I'm pretty close, but not quite there. I'd probably need another year of focused on reading, a few dozen more books of French, and I'll probably get there. My point is that the grammar exercises and the fill-in-the-blank exercises didn't actually contribute that much to actually acquiring these concepts. What contributed was just doing an incredible amount of reading, millions and millions of words. After a while, subjunctive, tenses, all the stuff in French was fine. It wasn't a big deal, and it all made sense. And I think that's the case with Latin. There's nothing about my experience so far that contradicts that. And again, I think there needs to be more pushback to the necessity of these fill-in-the-blank exercises. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do them. If you like them, do them, because that's fine. And that's not to say that there's no benefit, because any exposure to the language is good. But I would say most people don't like doing exercises. Most people find them very unfun. So I don't think you should do them if you don't like them. And I'll also say, I think part of the issue with the grammar fill-in-the-blank exercises is that it's kind of Familia Romana, because it's the fault of it sounds sometimes like I'm criticizing that textbook. It's a solid 8 out of 10 textbook. It's very good. For a beginner textbook, it's very good. But people need to calm down about it, because I think it gives people false impressions about learning Latin. People absolutely imply that you can read those 35,000 words in Familia Romana and be fluent in Latin. Like, you just can't. It's impossible, because there's just not enough input. There's just not enough stuff in there to learn the language. Even if you read it 100 times and do all the exercises, you're not going to be fluent in Latin. I don't care who you are. Like, it's just not possible. Maybe you think you were, and you ended up getting fluent because you read a bunch of other stuff, but you just can't learn a language with 35,000 words. You just can't. It's impossible. Maybe that's a bold statement, and I think that leads people to this idea that if you're not absorbing all these ideas and these grammar concepts when you're going through that book perfectly, then you're doing something wrong. And so they feel like they have to drill these fill-in-the-blank exercises and do them perfectly. But I think that's a result of people overhyping Familia Romana and its ability to single-handedly teach you the Latin language. Again, maybe people say like, oh, no one actually says you can learn Latin just through using Familia Romana. Maybe people don't specifically say that, but I think it is heavily implied to beginners, where people beginners can very easily be misled into thinking that, just based on the rhetoric sometimes people have. Again, the rhetoric is so funny. Like, people will be like, it's the most amazing pedagogical tool in the history of humankind. Like, maybe not exactly those words, but not too far off. And people just need to chill. Like, if you told a Spanish learner that I have the most amazing pedagogical textbook in the history of language learning, and they said for Spanish, I think people would laugh at you, because who cares? Whether you have like the most amazing textbook or not, as long as it covers the basics, the vocabulary and the grammar, and gives you enough input, it's like, who cares really how amazingly pedagogically appropriate it is? Like, yeah, it's nice, I guess, but you're not going to learn the language that way. You're going to learn the language through the sheer amount of input you get and the amount you engage with the text and with Latin. So I think there needs to be more pushback of the necessity of these exercises. I don't think it's necessary. I think it just makes Latin more boring, I guess. Maybe, I don't know, maybe people like doing them, and again, maybe it is the case. Maybe I'm just wrong, and maybe people have this magic ability. Maybe it's like there's specific people who really benefit from doing these fill-in-the-blank exercises, and their brain perfectly absorbs the grammar, and then they go off and can learn Latin and be fluent in less than 100,000 words or something. That seems impossible. That doesn't seem like that makes any sense the way I understand language learning, but maybe people have that experience. That's my rant. All my understanding of language learning, and from my observations and what I read about for people who actually got good at Latin and what they did and in other languages, confirms my own experience confirms my current model of language learning. And I'm not trying to criticize Familia Romana or anyone else's study methods. I just think sometimes there's a lot of conventional wisdom, because the Latin learning community is quite small compared to most language learning communities, online at least. I think there's a lot of groupthink and I think there are a lot of assumptions, and I think sometimes we need to push back on some of these assumptions about how to learn Latin and try different things and experiment and see what the result is. But sorry about the rant, but it's something I've been thinking about. All right, to wrap up this video that's gone on way too long, let's do some Anki, because I didn't do my Anki today, so I thought it'd be a fun way to wrap up today's update video. So right now, I have two decks, as I mentioned before, Lingua Latina, which is just the vocabulary in Familia Romana, and Fabula. It's going great. One thing I've been doing, though, is suspending any card with a interval of more than 3 months. So if the time between the next now and the next time the card shows up is more than 3 months, I suspend it. And the idea is that it's all basic vocab, so if I can go 3 months without forgetting it, I don't need the card anymore. So I'm just suspending it, and eventually, as I finish studying the deck, all the cards will be suspended, and then I just won't need the deck anymore, and then I'll just have my Latin sentence bending deck. Will I do that with I'm not sure I'll do that with the Latin sentence bending deck. I might, but I'm specifically doing it for Lingua Latina or Familia Romana, just because it's the beginner basic vocab that I'm not going to have to review, because I'll have seen it countless times by the time. Anyways, let's study it a little. We'll just do a few cards from each deck. I won't do my whole study session. All right. Should I read it out loud so you can hear my bad accent? Iam proculabes tostia homines qui in portu sunt vix oculis cerni possunt. So it's very hard for me to understand a sentence while reading it, so I'm just going to read it silently real quick. So it means, now far from Ostia, the people in the port could hardly with their eyes see the ship. That's my assumption. Now, I don't know what word is being tested here, but I think that's right. The understanding of the sentence was a clunky translation, but that's all good. So, cerni, so to see, infinitive. Yeah, to spot or to see, I guess. Close enough. I'll go with it. Let's do a couple more. Itaque luna non tan clara es quan sol. So this one's an easy one. And thus the moon is not as bright as the sun. There we go. Clara. My rolling R is not very good at all, by the way. I'm jealous of the people who learned Spanish or Italian before Latin, so they already have that kind of built in. I'm not super concerned about my pronunciation at the moment, but kind of wish I could roll my R, but I'll work on it eventually. Per aera hinc e volabimus. So by the air, hinc. I'm gonna say, I'm not really sure what that means. It's kind of like some of these words I'm a little vague on. I mean, the sentence means by air, let's fly, basically. I think e volabimus, I believe that is, I'm not sure if that's subjunctive or future. Sometimes they look similar. I'm going to say it's subjunctive. And hinc, It's like kind of like from here, I think, something like that. E volabimus, so it was future after a while. So my gut was future, and then I was like, I saw the A in the middle, and then sometimes that is subjunctive. So should I redo it? I guess I'll redo it because I got the tense wrong. Neptimus eius precibus per motus. So Neptune is kind of moved by their request or their plea. Agitated? Yeah, close enough, I guess. I don't know. We'll go with it. We'll do one more. Gawens tamen ne candidis ganymedis membris unguibus nocere. All right, so Cowens tamen ne candidis. So I think this means kind of like to be careful not to hurt the white arms of this person with his like claws. Candidis is like white or whitish, I guess. I'm a little confused about Cowen's Tamen, because Cowen's like Cowe, I think, is like to warn someone, but I think this is Cowen's is like to take care or to be careful. So, but close enough. I'll go with it. All right, let's do one more, then we'll do the other deck. Et baculo invalida membra ita sustineba. Yeah, so this one's I think easy. So baculo is just like a stick to support him. So invalida membra is like a leg that isn't working so great, and sustineba is to sustain, right? It's like a cognate. So pretty easy, and of course it's the ablative because it's the, I don't know what ablative form of that is, but so hopefully I didn't embarrass myself too much. Some of these like sentences without context are more tricky than I was expecting. With like when you're reading a story, it's much easier to understand these sentences, but in isolation sometimes it's trickier to understand. I guess it's all part of the learning process. All right, so let's take a look at the other deck just real quick. In primis cogidumnum seditionis accusaverat. So I think in primis means like first of all or in particular. Cogidumnum seditionis accusaverat. I think that means that seditionis means like betrayal or like, so he accused Cogidubnus. I don't know what his name, I don't know what would be the accusative or the nominative form, but he was accused, particularly he was accused of, this guy was accused of being a traitor. So Domina familiarem ad vilam invitavit. So familiarem is like relatives, or like, yeah, I think it's like relatives. It looks like it's like a cognate. For some reason this word is a struggle for me. He like invites them to the villa. So relation, relative, yeah. Domina familiarem ad vilam invitavit. Imprudens hoc fecit. Non voluit citaram confringere. So this came from one of those like short stories that were like sort of in the style of Lupitinicola. And so this is about so he did something imprudently, recklessly, and he didn't want to break the violin. Confringere. Citaram. I don't know if that's like, yeah, they didn't have violins in ancient Rome, so I'm not sure how that, I guess that's just word is used for violins in Neo-Latin, I guess. All right, let's do one more. It said, Vestes quibus me amicire soleo invenire non possum. Okay, this is actually a brand new card. So, but clothes to which I normally dress with, I couldn't find. So amicire means like to dress or to clothe. So cool. So that came from Pons Tiro, I think it's called. So, all right, so good enough. So hopefully I didn't embarrass myself too much. Again, the point of the Anki is just to remind me of the vocab, and Anki's going well. Again, not much to say. Just I finished all the vocab in the Cambridge Latin course. Now slowly adding new cards, but yeah. So that's my last. So that's 125 days, I think, something like that. 4 months of Latin. I learned a lot last month. Going good. All going according to plan. Little by little, my comprehension is growing. Some days I feel like the god of Latin. Sometimes I feel bad, but if I keep on reading, I'll get better and better. If you have any questions, let me know. But yeah, so far so good. Have a good one. Bye.